Hi guys, so we are on chapter 4, which is page 49 if you're following at home. David and Tucky watched from their bedroom window. The single beam of the searchlight from the village circled the sky above them, hesitating and retracing as it patterned the darkness. They were alone in the house that night. Mr. Reynolds had been called out on home guard duty, and Anne went up the village with him to warm up the soup. It happened like that once a week, and the boys were left to look after things on the farm. "It's like firework night," said Tucky, resting his chin on his hands. And it was. There was the orange glow of fires, and the tracer for the anti-aircraft guns peppered the horizon with flashes and trails of hyphenated lights. They watched it as if they were on display. It was all a long way away, very different from the London raids they had both been through. Here someone else was being bombed, not them. "Tucky!" David whispered, grabbing his arm. "What? Listen, can you hear it?" It was clear enough now, the deep throb of aircraft engines, punctuated by spluttering. They leaned farther out of the window and craned upwards, scanning the night sky. It came from over the moor, and they saw it at the same time. A red flicker first, and then 3 more lights floating down through the sky above the moor. But the throbbing and coughing had stopped now, and there was silence. "The searchlight," said David. "Why doesn't it come this way? They'll miss it." But the searchlight was carving up the sky above the village at that moment, and the boys followed the lights as they fell lower and lower until they disappeared behind the moor. "It's gone," said Tucky. "It's a German, wasn't it, Davy?" "Crashed. It must have crashed. It was going down all the time. There'd have been a bang, an explosion or something." Tucky pulled his head back inside. "Could have landed." David was thinking of the flat valleys on the moor. "Could have, you know. There's places where a plane could land out there." "In the dark? With no engines? Come on, Davy. It's gone behind a hill, that's all." "Then where is it now, eh? Gone behind another hill? What goes down must come up. If it doesn't come up, it's crashed or it's landed, one or the other." Tucky saw the sense in that, and they both kept watch, searching the darkness where the lights had vanished. And that's what they were doing when they heard Mr. Reynolds' van splashing through the mud by the front gate. Tucky was downstairs first and threw open the kitchen door. Anne was standing there taking off her scarf. "We saw a bomber, Anne, a German bomber. We heard it and we saw it. There were lights, Anne, and David thinks it's gone down on the moor. There were lights and they were coming down all the time. Then they stopped. We saw it, honest we did, and the engines were chugging and they were popping." "Tucky, Tucky!" Anne put an arm around him and brought him back into the light of the room. "Don't be so excited, Tucky. How often do I tell you you must wear shoes on a stone floor? You can catch a cold that way." "What's up, Anne?" Mr. Reynolds came in behind her. "A plane crashed," said David, simply, getting in before Tucky could start up again. "It must have been one of the bombers." Mr. Reynolds smiled. "I've been on searchlight all evening, my dear, and we saw them bombing around Plymouth, but we never saw a plane. No one saw a thing." "You missed it," David said. "It was out over the moor and your searchlight was way above the village." "Are you certain, Davy?" Mr. Reynolds had stopped smiling now. "'Tis got to be for certain, you know." "We heard Mr. Reynolds, honest we did," Tucky said, feeling left out by now. "It sounded just like the bombers used to sound in London, just the same." Mr. Reynolds and Anne looked at each other. "And the engines were popping, just like Tucky says?" David could see they believed him now. "Popping?" Anne said. "What does it mean, this popping?" "Must mean the plane had engine trouble of some sort," said Mr. Reynolds, looking from one of the boys to the other. "Could have been it. Were there any flames? Did you see any flames coming out of her?" "Just the popping," Tucky said. "Then nothing. And then the lights just went out." Mr. Reynolds bent down and pulled the boys in towards him so that he could see the look on their faces. "If there's been a plane down, I'll have to report it. There'll be the army and the police, and they'll be wanting to ask you questions. Lots of questions. Now think very carefully, my dears. It must be for certain. Was there a plane?" "We saw it, Mr. Reynolds." David said. And you're sure it came down over the moor? The boys nodded. It was there, Mr. Reynolds, said Tucky. I promise. They're good boys, Jerry, Anne said. They would not lie. I know that, my dear, said Mr. Reynolds, standing up, but the army don't know that, and neither do the police. They're the ones we will have to convince. You did well to spot it, my dears, and I'll be off back up the village to report it. There won't be much they can do till morning, and they'll be bound to want to see you. So get off to bed, you both. Anne went upstairs with them, and they watched the glow of the fires on the horizon as Plymouth burned. She made them hot milk and sat on their bed while they drank it. It's a terrible thing they do, she said sadly, gazing out of the window. When I was young, I watched fires burning in my country too. It's a terrible thing they do. She spoke as the boys had never heard her before. You're not English, are you, Anne? David had wanted to ask her that for a very long time, but the moment had never quite been right. I'm French, Anne said. I was French until I married Jerry. Now I'm English, like you, but I still think of France as my country. Like you, Davy, I know what it is like to lose a father in the war. She took their mugs and left the room quickly. Now I know why she hates Germans, Tucky said quietly, as soon as her footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. And later, when they were in bed, Tucky could not help thinking about it. You're lucky. Lucky? If my dad was killed, I'd tell everyone. I'd be proud. I am proud, Tucky. Anne's proud too, but it's better to have a father alive than be proud because he's dead. Depends on your father, Tucky went on. And people like you if your father's dead. They like you more anyway. Do you like Anne more because her father's dead? David said. And me, what about me? We were friends years ago. Suppose so, said Tucky soulfully, and then he thought about the plane again. Davy, if that plane crashed like you said, and there'll be men on board, there'll be Germans, do you think they'll find them? I hope they're dead, David said. They must have killed hundreds of people in Plymouth tonight. I hope they're dead. They deserve it. Neither of them slept much that night, and they heard Mr. Reynolds coming back in the van some hours later. David thought of getting out of bed and asking about the plane, about what was being done, but he heard Anne and Mr. Reynolds talking together down in the kitchen, and somehow he didn't want to see Anne again that night. Tucky got out of bed and tried to listen through the floorboards, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. Then a floorboard creaked and he scrambled back into his bed. It was still dark when Mr. Reynolds woke them. He was in his Home Guard uniform. The army's downstairs. They'll want to be out on the moor by daybreak, and they want you to come along and show them where it was you saw the plane. Quick as you can, my dears. We can't go till you're ready. The kitchen was full of uniforms, police and soldiers, and they all stood watching them eat down their porridge that Anne insisted they must have before they left. David looked up occasionally from his plate of steaming porridge and recognised some of the faces behind the uniforms. They looked tired and disbelieving. Mr. Reynolds was bending over a map with a tall soldier in a peaked cap and a wet mackintosh. "'Twas out of the bedroom window, sir," he was saying, "so it must be in this area here, somewhere, almost for certain." "But Reynolds," the officer took off his cap and shook it, "there's 2 observation posts between here and there. Surely if there had been a plane, someone else would have spotted it." "Not if they were following the searchlight, sir. The boys say the searchlight was sweeping over the village itself at the time." The officer turned to face the boys. He had a mean face with a thin moustache that barely covered his top lip. "You say they're evacuees, Reynolds?" "That's right, sir, and fine lads they are too, sir. Been with us for 3 months now, and if they say they saw it, then you can be sure that they did." "Quite so, Reynolds," said the officer, but he did not sound convinced. Outside, it was a drizzly grey dawn. There was a whole convoy of trucks blocking the lane, and the officer gave the order to get started. Anne wrapped them in scarves, and then they followed Mr. Reynolds and clambered into the back of a jeep at the head of the column. The officer with the thin moustache clambered in front and nodded to his driver. "I hope they're all right, Reynolds." There's 30 Home Guard and a whole company from the barracks on this search. I hope you're right. I'm going to end this part looking at this picture.